The woman in seat 2A didn't look up when he sat down. She didn't need to. One glance was enough: worn sneakers, a faded backpack, a jacket that had seen too many winters. Evelyn Carter set down her champagne glass and turned to the flight attendant, with the calm certainty of someone who had never once been told no. "Excuse me," she said loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Get him out. I didn't pay for first class to sit next to someone like him." The man said nothing, not one word. 3 days later, he was sitting at the head of her boardroom. Evelyn Carter had built her entire career on the belief that appearances told the truth. The cut of a suit, the brand of a watch, the way someone carried themselves through a room, these things were not shallow observations. They were data. And data in her world was everything. She had climbed from a mid-level analyst position at 24 to the youngest female director in Hartwell Capital's 40-year history by reading rooms faster than anyone else and acting before doubt could slow her down. People called it instinct. Evelyn called it discipline. She had earned her seat in first class the same way she had earned everything else, through relentless work and zero tolerance for mediocrity. The flight from Chicago to New York was not leisure. It was preparation. She had a presentation to finalize, a board meeting in 3 days, and a CEO title that was by every reasonable measure already hers. The only thing left was the formality of the vote, and Evelyn had never lost a vote she had prepared for. She was on her second read-through of the quarterly projections when she heard the overhead bin close 2 rows back and felt the seat beside her shift with new weight. She didn't look up immediately. The cabin had been quiet, and she had allowed herself the rare comfort of assuming it would stay that way. When she finally turned, what she saw did not match the environment in any way she was willing to accept. The man settling into seat 2B was unremarkable in the precise way that made Evelyn's jaw tighten. He wore dark jeans that had been washed too many times, a plain gray Henley, and a jacket that sat wrong at the shoulders, not because it didn't fit, but because it looked like something bought practical rather than chosen with care. His backpack, dark canvas with a fraying strap at the left buckle, went into the overhead bin alongside luggage that probably cost more than his monthly rent. He had no laptop bag, no leather portfolio. He pulled out a battered paperback and opened it without looking at anything or anyone around him. Evelyn stared for 3 full seconds before the discomfort sharpened into something more directed. This was a first-class cabin. The tickets were not cheap, not even close. And while she had no particular interest in how other people spent their money, she had a very particular interest in her immediate surroundings, and her immediate surroundings had just become a problem. She caught the eye of Sandra, the lead flight attendant, and raised 2 fingers from her armrest in the small, practiced gesture of someone accustomed to being understood without effort. Sandra crossed the cabin with a professional smile already assembled. "Is everything all right, Miss Carter?" Evelyn kept her voice even and her volume deliberate, not shouting, but not lowering it for anyone's comfort either. "This gentleman appears to be in the wrong section," she said. "I'd like someone to verify his seat assignment." Sandra turned to the man with a courteous expression. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" The man closed his book with 1 finger marking his page and reached into his jacket pocket. He handed the boarding pass to Sandra without a word, without irritation, without any of the defensive energy Evelyn had expected. Sandra checked it, checked the seat number, and handed it back. "Everything is in order, Miss Carter. Seat 2B, first class confirmed." The smile Sandra offered was still professional, but the warmth had thinned slightly at the edges. Evelyn noticed. She didn't care. "Then I'd like to be moved," Evelyn said. "Or he can be." The cabin had gone quiet in that specific way that happens when people are very carefully pretending not to listen. 3 rows back, a man in a window seat had his phone angled in a direction that had nothing to do with the runway outside. Evelyn did not notice that. She was focused on the problem in front of her. Sandra kept her expression neutral. "Miss Carter, the flight is at full capacity in this cabin. I'm afraid there are no other available first-class seats." "Then upgrade someone from business and move me." Evelyn picked up her champagne flute and took a sip with the unhurried certainty of someone who expects logistics to bend around her preferences. I didn't pay for this seat to spend 4 hours uncomfortable. The man in 2B had not looked up from his boarding pass. He folded it once and returned it to his pocket, and reopened his book to the marked page. He gave no indication that the conversation happening 12 inches from his left shoulder had anything to do with him. That indifference, more than anything else, irritated Evelyn past the point of restraint. "Excuse me," she said directly to him for the first time. Her tone was the one she used with junior analysts who had submitted flawed reports, not cruel, but final. "I think it would be easier for everyone if you asked to be reseated. There are perfectly good seats in the next cabin." He looked up then. Not with anger, not with embarrassment. His expression was simply attentive, the way someone looks when they are making sure they have heard a thing correctly, before deciding whether it requires a response. His eyes were steady and dark, and they stayed on her face for a moment, that stretched just past comfortable, before he returned to his book without saying a single word. Evelyn felt the heat move up her neck. In her professional life, silence was a negotiating tactic. People went quiet when they were calculating, when they were afraid, when they were stalling. This man's silence had none of those textures. It was simply indifferent. And indifference was not something Evelyn Carter had encountered very often, and never from someone wearing a $20 jacket in her section of the plane. She turned back to Sandra with her voice dropped low and her expression stripped of all performance. "Get him out. I didn't pay for first class to sit next to someone like him." The words landed in the cabin like something dropped from a height. A woman 2 rows forward shifted in her seat. The man with the angled phone went very still. Sandra's professional expression held, but her eyes moved once briefly involuntarily to the passenger in 2B. He did not react. He turned a page. Sandra excused herself to speak with a colleague near the galley. There was a murmured exchange, a brief check of the manifest on the tablet, and then Sandra returned with the same measured composure she had maintained throughout. "Ms. Carter, I'm not able to ask a confirmed first-class passenger to change sections without cause. If you'd like, I can see whether there's any flexibility with seating arrangements, but I cannot." "Fine." Evelyn pulled her presentation folder back onto her tray table and set her jaw. "Fine, then we're done." The flight departed on schedule. Evelyn spent the first 40 minutes reviewing her materials with the focused aggression of someone redirecting frustration into productivity. The man beside her read his paperback. He accepted water when offered, declined the meal, and at no point attempted conversation, eye contact, or any acknowledgement that the woman to his right had just tried to have him removed from his seat in front of a full cabin. The flight landed at JFK at 6:47 in the evening. Evelyn was on her feet before the seatbelt sign extinguished, bag already in hand. The incident filed away in the part of her mind where she stored things that had annoyed her, but ultimately hadn't mattered. She had a car waiting. She had 3 days to finalize a decade's worth of ambition. She had no interest in whatever the man in the worn jacket was headed toward. She walked off the jet bridge and into the terminal without looking back. By the time Evelyn arrived at the Meridian Hotel and opened her laptop, it had been 4 hours since the flight landed. She ordered room service, reviewed her slide deck for the 3rd time, and sent 2 follow-up emails to her assistant, before finally allowing herself to close her eyes for 20 minutes before the morning started. She did not check social media. She rarely did. It was noise, and Evelyn had no patience for noise when she was close to something important. It was her assistant, a sharp and perpetually caffeinated young woman named Claire, who called at 7 the next morning, with a voice that carried the particular kind of careful calm that precedes bad news. "Evelyn, before you see anything online, I need you to know that I'm already working on it." Evelyn was standing at the window of her hotel room, with her coffee, watching the early gray of a New York morning settle over Midtown. "What are you working on?" "There's a video," Claire said, "from last night's flight. Someone filmed the exchange in first class and posted it around midnight. It's been shared a lot." Evelyn set her coffee down slowly. "How much is a lot?" "As of 30 minutes ago, the clip has been viewed 400,000 times. It's trending on 2 platforms." Claire's voice stayed steady, but the care with which she was choosing her words said everything about how the video looked. The headline most people are using is, "Executive demands man removed from first class for how he looks." The silence in the room was not the kind Evelyn manufactured in negotiations. It was the kind that happens when a person's understanding of their immediate situation undergoes a rapid and unwelcome revision. "Send me the link," she said. She watched it once. 47 seconds of footage, slightly shaky, shot from a rear-facing angle that captured her profile clearly, and her words clearly, and the man's composure with devastating clarity. She looked exactly as she had felt in that moment, certain, controlled, and entirely at ease with what she was saying. That was the problem. There was nothing to walk back. There was no moment where she looked uncertain or regretful. She looked like someone who meant every word, because she had. The comments were not something she read past the first screen. She called Claire back. "Get Marcus on the phone. I want the PR team in a call by 9. Marcus Webb had been Hartwell Capital's head of communications for 11 years and had managed crises that made this look like a minor weather event. Regulatory investigations, a fraud allegation that turned out to be a disgruntled contractor, a CFO resignation timed 48 hours before an earnings call. He was methodical and unflappable, and when Evelyn connected to the 9 o'clock call, he already had a draft statement on screen. "The instinct is to move fast," Marcus said. "Get ahead of it with a clear, direct apology before the news cycle hardens the narrative. Something personal, not corporate. You, not the company." Evelyn had her own instincts, and they were pulling in a different direction. A public apology to her felt like confirmation. It would validate every person who had watched that clip and drawn the worst possible conclusion from a 47-second moment they had no context for. She had been in a difficult travel situation. She had asked for assistance from staff. That was not a fireable offense in any framework she recognized. "What's the alternative?" she asked. "The alternative, Cartois," Marcus said with the tone of a man who already knew which option his client was going to choose and was bracing accordingly, "is that you stay quiet and let it cycle out. Which works sometimes if there's nothing else to feed it. But right now, the story has legs because there's a mystery. Nobody knows who the man is. People are speculating. As long as he's anonymous, the narrative stays exactly where it is, you on the wrong side of it." Evelyn considered that. The man had said nothing publicly. No statement, no interview, no post of his own. He had simply disappeared back into whatever life he came from, and his silence was somehow louder than anything Evelyn had said on that plane. "Find out who he is," she said. It took Marcus's team less than 6 hours to confirm that the trail went almost nowhere. The name on the boarding pass was Daniel Brooks. There were no major public profiles, no LinkedIn with a recognizable company, no news articles, no speaking engagements, no association memberships. There was a Delaware business registration tied to a holding company called Brooks Advisory Group, filed 9 years ago, and a single real estate transaction in Connecticut from 4 years prior. Nothing else that was findable through standard channels. Marcus called Evelyn at 3 in the afternoon, with the kind of hesitation she had learned to read as worse than bad news. "We can't build a clear profile on him. What we can confirm is that there are internal access credentials tied to his name in Hartwell's own system. High-level clearance, the kind that doesn't belong to an employee." Evelyn stood very still in her hotel room. "What kind of clearance?" "Board level 4, Marcus said. "Maybe higher. I flagged it to our general counsel and she told me to stop digging." The stop digging was the part that stayed with Evelyn long after she ended the call. In her experience, people told you to stop digging for exactly 2 reasons. Either there was nothing there, or there was something too large to handle through normal channels. Marcus's tone had not suggested the first reason. Evelyn moved to the window again and looked out over the city she had come to conquer, with her presentation polished, and her arguments razor sharp, and her confidence worn like a second skin for so long, she had forgotten what it felt like to be uncertain. She thought about the man in the worn jacket, the way he had turned a page, the way he had looked at her for exactly as long as was necessary, and then simply looked away, as though her words had not landed hard enough to require a response. She thought about the board meeting 2 days away, and for the first time in a very long while, Evelyn Carter felt something she didn't have a clean name for settle at the base of her chest. Not fear exactly, but its quiet, better-dressed cousin. She told herself it was nothing. She had bigger things to prepare for. She went back to her presentation and read it for the 4th time. The morning of the board meeting arrived the way most consequential mornings do, ordinary on the surface, with nothing in the light or the air to signal what was coming. Evelyn was up at 5:30, dressed by 6:15, and in the back of a car headed to Hartwell Capital's Midtown headquarters by 6:40. She had her presentation loaded on her tablet, her talking points rehearsed to the point where they no longer felt like rehearsal, and a dark wool blazer that she had worn to every major meeting for the past 3 years because it had never once failed her. The PR situation had not resolved cleanly, but it had stabilized. The video had peaked at just over 1.2 million views before the news cycle found something newer and louder to chase. Marcus had released a carefully worded statement on Evelyn's behalf, not an apology exactly, but a gesture toward one acknowledging that the exchange had been handled poorly under stress, and affirming Hartwell Capital's commitment to respectful conduct. It had been enough to stop the bleeding without requiring Evelyn to stand in front of a camera and perform contrition she didn't entirely feel. The board had been briefed. The shareholders had received reassurance. The storm, by all visible measures, had passed. What had not passed was the question of Daniel Brooks. Marcus's team had continued pulling at threads and continued finding nothing useful. Brooks' advisory group remained a clean wall. The internal access credentials remained unexplained. Hartwell's general counsel, a precise and carefully worded woman named Patricia Holt, had responded to every follow-up inquiry with variations of the same answer, that the matter was above her pay grade and would be addressed in the appropriate forum at the appropriate time. Patricia Holt did not traffic in vague language. The fact that she was using it now should have told Evelyn something. It did tell her something. She chose to file it in the same drawer as the discomfort she'd felt in her hotel room and focus on what she could control. She walked into Hartwell Capital's 42nd floor conference room at 7:58 with 2 minutes to spare and the composure of someone who had been built for exactly this room. The table seated 16. 12 of those seats were already filled board members, 2 independent directors, the outgoing CEO, Robert Aldrich, who was stepping down after 22 years, and who had, over the past 18 months, made clear in every way short of a written memo that he believed Evelyn was the right person to replace him. She had his endorsement. She had the numbers. She had the record. What she did not have until she looked toward the head of the table was any understanding of what she was actually walking into. The chair at the top of the room was not empty, and it was not occupied by Robert Aldrich, who typically ran the pre-vote proceedings from that position as a courtesy. The man sitting there had a plain leather portfolio in front of him and a glass of water to his right, and the same expression of patient, unhurried attention that Evelyn had last seen 36 inches away from her on a flight from Chicago. Daniel Brooks looked up when she entered. He did not smile. He did not look surprised. He simply looked at her, the way he had looked at her on the plane, directly and without apology, and then returned his attention to the document in front of him. Evelyn's stride did not break. She was too trained for that. But something in her chest hit a wall at full speed, and the reverb of it was still moving through her when she reached her seat and pulled out her chair and sat down with her tablet and her folder and her 3 years of preparation and her completely insufficient understanding of what was happening. Robert Aldrich cleared his throat from the seat to Daniel's left. When he spoke, his voice carried the particular weight of a man delivering information he had been carrying for some time and was relieved to finally set down. "Before we begin the formal agenda," Robert said, "I want to introduce Daniel Brooks to those of you who haven't had the opportunity to meet him personally. Daniel is the majority private shareholder of Hartwell Capital. He has held that position for the past 7 years, following a private acquisition that was structured at his request, with full confidentiality agreements in place. As of this meeting, and at Daniel's discretion, that confidentiality is being lifted. Robert looked around the table with the calm of a man whose role in this particular drama had been largely administrative. Daniel holds 70% of Hartwell's outstanding shares. He has the authority to approve or veto any executive appointment at the board level. That includes the CEO position we're here to discuss today. The room absorbed this in the particular silence of people who are recalibrating very quickly and trying not to show it. Several board members who had clearly been briefed beforehand maintained expressions of careful neutrality. Several who had not shifted almost imperceptibly in their seats, the way people do when the ground has moved, and they're deciding whether to acknowledge it. Evelyn heard every word. She processed them with the part of her brain that had been trained to process information under pressure and keep her face exactly where she needed it to be. But underneath that, underneath the discipline and the composure and the dark wool blazer that had never failed her, something had come completely loose, and she could feel the weight of it swinging free with nowhere to land. Daniel set down the document he'd been reviewing and folded his hands on the table. "Thank you, Robert." His voice was measured and unhurried, the same as everything else about him. "I'll keep this brief. I've been a silent partner in this company for 7 years because that was the arrangement that suited the work. I'm here today because the CEO transition is a decision I want to be present for." He looked around the table without theater or performance. "I've reviewed all the candidate materials. I'd like to proceed with the formal presentations as scheduled, and I'll share my perspective after. That's all." He did not look at Evelyn when he said it. That somehow was worse than if he had. The presentations proceeded as planned, which was either a testament to Hartwell's institutional composure or simply evidence that no one in that room knew what else to do. Evelyn presented second between 2 other internal candidates, whose cases were solid, but not competitive with hers on paper. She delivered her presentation the way she had delivered every high-stakes presentation for the past decade, with precision, with confidence, and with the particular fluency that comes from having prepared for something longer than anyone else in the room. Her numbers were correct. Her strategy was sound. Her vision for the company's next 5 years was, by any objective measure, the strongest case on the table. She knew this. She had always known this. What she hadn't known, what no preparation in the world could have accounted for, was that the man with the final vote was the same man she had publicly humiliated 36 hours ago on a flight she had boarded with every expectation of being untouchable. When the formal presentations ended, the room broke for 20 minutes. Evelyn stepped into the hallway and stood near the window at the far end, with her tablet under her arm, and the particular stillness of someone who is working very hard not to appear as though they are reassessing everything. Claire texted twice. She didn't respond. Marcus sent a message asking how it was going. She put her phone face down in her blazer pocket. She needed to speak to Daniel before the vote. That was the clear, cold conclusion her mind arrived at once the initial shock had drained enough for logic to move through. Whatever had happened on that plane, whatever he thought of her, she was a professional, and so was he. And professionals separated the personal from the business when the stakes required it. That was what she believed. That was what she needed to believe in order to take the steps she took next. She found him near the glass partition at the corridor's end, standing alone with his water glass, reading something on his phone without urgency. She approached with her shoulders back and her voice calibrated to the register she used when she wanted to communicate equal footing. "Mr. Brooks." She stopped 2 feet away, close enough to be direct, far enough to be respectful. "I think it would be worthwhile for us to speak privately before the vote. 5 minutes." Daniel looked up from his phone, the same attentive expression waiting. He waited, which forced her to continue. "I understand the circumstances of our first meeting were not ideal, Evelyn said. "And I think professionally, we're both capable of setting that aside and evaluating what actually serves this company best." She kept her voice clean of any plea. She was not pleading. She was negotiating, which was different, and the distinction mattered enormously to her. "My record speaks for itself. My strategy is the strongest on that table, and you know it." Daniel studied her face for a moment. Not unkindly, but not warmly. Either the way a person looks at something they are deciding how to categorize. When he spoke, his voice carried the same flat temperature it had held in the boardroom. "Your presentation was strong," he said. "It was the strongest in the room. You're right about that." Evelyn felt the first loosening of the tension in her chest. Then, "The presentation isn't the only thing I'm evaluating," Daniel said. Not harshly, simply. "I'll seize you back inside." He returned to the conference room before she did. She stood at the glass partition for 4 seconds, with her jaw set and her hand very still at her side, and then she followed him in. What happened over the next 72 hours moved faster than any crisis Evelyn had navigated before, and she had navigated several. The board vote was inconclusive, not a defeat, but not a victory either. 2 members had requested a delay pending further review of leadership conduct, citing the viral video as an unresolved reputational concern. The delay was granted. Evelyn's CEO appointment, which had been a formality 48 hours ago, was now suspended in a procedural limbo that the financial press immediately characterized as a leadership crisis. Then the second video surfaced. It was older footage shot at a private company dinner 14 months prior at a venue in Chicago, where the dress code had been cocktail attire and the wine had been expensive, and Evelyn had apparently said things to and about junior staff that she did not remember saying, but recognized watching the footage as entirely within the range of things she had been known to say in rooms she considered private. The footage was short, under 2 minutes, but it was specific. Names were used. The laughter at the end of one particular exchange, hers, was the kind that leaves no interpretive room. The origin of the footage was never fully established. What was established within hours of its circulation was that 3 institutional shareholders had placed calls to Hartwell's investor relations team, and 2 major client accounts had reached out to their relationship managers with questions that were not technically demands, but functioned as warnings. Marcus called Evelyn at 9 that evening and used the phrase "structural threat to the business" for the first time, which was a phrase Evelyn had heard him use exactly once before in 11 years, and which she had always quietly categorized as hyperbole. It was not hyperbole. By the following morning, Hartwell's stock had dropped 6% at open. By midday, the board had convened an emergency session without her. Patricia Holt called at 2:15 to inform her in language that was professional and precise, and entirely without cruelty, that the board had voted to suspend her executive duties pending a formal conduct review. Evelyn was in her hotel room when she took that call. She was still in the blazer she had put on at 6:15 that morning, which felt like it had happened in a different week. She stood at the window, the same window where she had stood 2 nights earlier, feeling the quiet cousin of fear. And this time, there was nothing to distinguish it from the real thing. The calls she made in the next hour went unanswered, or were answered with the careful apologetic brevity of people managing their own exposure. A board member she had lunched with monthly for 2 years. A partner at an institutional shareholder she had cultivated for the better part of a decade. Her mentor from her early career, a man named Gerald Foster, who had once told her in a formal performance review that she had the sharpest strategic mind he had encountered in 30 years of finance. Gerald's assistant told her he was unavailable and would return calls in the order received. Evelyn sat down on the edge of the bed with her phone on the nightstand and her blazer still on, and the city outside moving with complete indifference to whatever was happening on the 31st floor of the Meridian Hotel. She thought about the PR statement Marcus had drafted, the one that had acknowledged poor handling under stress without quite being an apology. She thought about the word choices she had signed off on, and the ones she had pushed back on, and the ones that, in retrospect, had been chosen specifically to preserve something she was now watching empty out in real time. She thought about Daniel Brooks on the plane, the turned page, the complete absence of reaction, and she understood, sitting there in the quiet of a room that suddenly felt very large, that his silence had never been indifference. It had been something else entirely. Something that looked from a distance like a man with nothing to defend, because he had nothing to lose. Evelyn had never understood that kind of quiet before. She was beginning to. The conduct review took 11 days. Evelyn knew this because she counted them not with any particular hope attached to the counting, but because it was the only metric left that she had any relationship with. Everything else had been removed from her hands with a procedural efficiency that she might have admired under different circumstances. Her access badge still opened the building's lobby doors, but her credentials to the executive floor had been quietly deactivated sometime on the second day. She discovered this when she tried to go in, and the elevator panel simply did not respond to her card, and the security desk attendant looked at her with the careful blankness of someone who had been briefed. She did not make a scene. That at least was something she could control. The press had moved on from the original video by the 4th day, but the suspension had given everything a second life. Financial trade publications ran pieces with phrases like leadership vacuum and cultural reckoning, and quoted anonymous sources close to the board in ways that Evelyn could map almost precisely to the people she had called and not heard back from. Marcus had stopped offering strategic recommendations and started offering what he called realistic framing, which was his professional way of telling her that the window for managing this narrative had closed, and they were now simply managing the aftermath. She stayed at the Meridian for the first week, because going back to Chicago felt like a concession she wasn't ready to make. By the 8th day, the hotel room had become a particular kind of cage, clean and expensive, and completely empty of anything that mattered. She had her laptop and her files and the view of Midtown that she had once found energizing and now found merely large. She ordered meals she didn't finish. She slept in fragments. She ran through the same loop of decisions and moments and words, trying to locate the precise point where things could have gone differently. And every time she ran it, the loop ended in the same place. Seat 2A, a champagne glass in her hand, a man in a gray Hendley minding his own business, while she made certain the entire cabin understood her position. She called Daniel's office on the 9th day. Not Marcus's idea. In fact, Marcus had specifically recommended against it, with the careful phrasing of someone who knows their client won't listen, but wants the record to reflect the advice was given. She was not calling to negotiate. She had thought about this carefully enough to be certain of that. She was calling because there was something that needed to be said, and she had spent 9 days finding every other possible way to avoid saying it, and had finally run out of alternatives. His assistant, a man named Thomas, who had a professional telephone manner so precise it bordered on sculptural, took her name and told her he would pass the message along. She expected nothing. Daniel called back within the hour. "Miss Carter." His voice on the phone was steady and deliberate, the same as it had been in the boardroom and in the corridor. Evelyn was standing at the hotel window. She had not planned what to say beyond the first sentence, which was the most honest thing she had prepared in weeks. "I'd like to meet with you," she said. "Not about the vote or the review. I need to say something to you directly, and I'd prefer to do it in person." There was a beat of quiet on the line. "Tomorrow morning," Daniel said. 9 o'clock. I'll send you the address." The address was a building in Lower Manhattan that Evelyn did not recognize. Not a corporate tower, not a hotel lobby, but a narrow brick building on a side street that housed on its 3rd floor a small suite of offices. So quietly furnished, they looked less like a power center than a place where someone actually worked. There were no receptionists in the outer room. Thomas was there at a desk near the window, and he showed her into a plain office with 2 chairs, a low table, a window facing the street, and Daniel Brooks sitting in one of the chairs with a coffee and nothing else. He did not stand when she entered, not out of rudeness, but out of the same quality that had characterized everything about him. No performance, no theater, no adjustment of behavior based on what the moment seemed to call for socially. Evelyn took the opposite chair without being asked and set her bag on the floor beside her and clasped her hands in her lap. She had rehearsed nothing beyond the decision to be direct. "What I said on that plane was wrong," she said. "Not wrong because it cost me professionally. Wrong because it was designed to diminish someone in public based on how they looked, and I knew what I was doing when I did it. I'm not here to ask you for anything. I just needed to say that to you clearly, without a PR statement in between." Daniel listened with the same attentiveness he brought to everything. When she finished, he didn't immediately respond. He turned his coffee cup once on the table with 2 fingers looking at it, and then he looked back at her. "How long did it take you to figure out what you actually wanted to say?" he asked. The question was not unkind. It was genuinely curious, which made it harder to deflect. 8 days, Evelyn said, give or take. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the adjacent thing. "That's honest," he said. "I'm trying to be," she said. "I'm aware that's a recent development." There was a quality to the quiet between them that Evelyn had not expected. Not hostile, not warm, but real, in a way that most of her professional interactions hadn't been in longer than she could accurately estimate. She had spent her career in rooms where everyone was performing something: confidence, authority, collegiality, indifference. This room had none of that, and the absence of it was disorienting in a way she hadn't anticipated, and found unexpectedly something close to a relief. Daniel set down his coffee. "I've read everything in your file," he said. "Not just the presentation. Your full record, the accounts you built, the teams you managed, the decisions you made under pressure over 10 years. You're as good at this work as you believe you are." He said this without flattery, as a simple statement of fact, the way he might confirm a line item on a balance sheet. "That's not the problem." Evelyn held his gaze. "I know what the problem is." "Then you know what has to change isn't the strategy," Daniel said. She had known this was coming, had known it in the abstract for several days, but hearing it said, plainly without cushioning or euphemism, landed differently than the abstract had. She looked at her hands in her lap for a moment, and then back at him. "You're going to tell me I need to resign." "I'm going to tell you," Daniel said, "that if you want to lead this company, or any company in a way that actually works long term, you need to understand what you're leading. And right now, you don't. You understand numbers and structure and competitive positioning. You don't understand the people underneath those things." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, voice staying level. "The conduct review will conclude next week. The board's recommendation is going to be termination. I have the authority to override that recommendation." He let that land before continuing. "I'm not going to override it." Evelyn nodded once slowly. She had known this too. Knowing it and hearing it were different experiences, and she allowed herself to sit with the difference for exactly as long as it took to process before she spoke again. "And after that, that's up to you," Daniel said. "There's a position open in Hartwell's portfolio analytics division, junior level. The work is real, the team is small, and nobody in that office knows your name yet, in the way they know it now." He looked at her steadily. "If you want it, it's yours. Not as a favor. As a starting point." Evelyn's first instinct, the one that had been running her life for the better part of a decade, was immediate and loud. It named the offer what it looked like from the outside: a humiliation, a demotion, a public reduction of everything she had built herself into. She felt it the way she always felt her first instincts, as something physical and certain in her chest. She had trusted that instinct for so long and so completely that going against it felt less like a decision and more like stepping off a ledge. She thought about the hotel room, the 8 days of ceiling and room service, and a view she had stopped seeing. She thought about the phone calls that went to voicemail and the people who had once stood in her orbit and now stood at a careful distance, recalibrating their proximity based on what was useful. She thought about a 47-second video of herself saying words she had meant, and the strange vertigo of watching your own certainty become evidence against you. "I'll take it," she said. Daniel studied her face for a moment, not testing, not suspicious, just reading the way he had read her on the plane and in the boardroom and in the corridor. Whatever he found, there seemed to satisfy some internal threshold, because he gave a single small nod and reached for his coffee again. "Thomas will send you the details this afternoon." Evelyn picked up her bag from the floor and stood. She had said what she came to say, and received what she had not dared to expect, which was not mercy exactly, but something more useful than mercy. A door left open, and the clear understanding that she would have to walk through it herself. "Why?" she asked before she could stop herself. She had not planned the question. It came from somewhere below the layer where she planned things. "You could have let the board vote go the way it was going. You didn't have to offer anything." Daniel looked up at her from his chair. The low morning light from the window caught the side of his face, and he looked in that moment simply like a person who had thought carefully about something for a long time and arrived at a position he was comfortable with. "Because destroying someone who's capable of change is a waste," he said. "And I've never been interested in waste." Evelyn left the building and walked 2 blocks before she stopped on the sidewalk and stood there for a moment, with the city moving around her in every direction. She was not the same person who had boarded a flight from Chicago several days ago with a presentation and a certainty that the universe was organized in the way she had always understood it to be. That person had been stripped down to something rawer and less finished, and the rawness was uncomfortable in a way that was also, she was beginning to understand the beginning of something different. She walked to the subway. She had not taken the subway in 4 years. She took it now. 7 months later, the Portfolio Analytics division of Hartwell Capital occupied a floor that Evelyn had never set foot on during her years as a director. It was not a glamorous floor. The carpet was the utilitarian gray of a space that received no client visits. The monitors were large and practical, and the people who worked there arrived at 7:30 and left when the work was done, rather than when the optics required. Nobody wore blazers as armor. Nobody performed anything for anyone. Evelyn had been wrong about many things, but she had not been wrong about one. She was good at the work. The analytics team had taken 2 months to trust her, not because they knew her name from the news, though some of them did, but because trust in that office was built through accuracy and consistency over time, and not granted for any other reason. She had put her head down and been accurate and consistent, and said nothing about what she had been or where she had come from, and by the 5th month, she was running a modeling project that the division had a quiet and exacting man named Robert Greer had described in a staff meeting as the most rigorous analysis his team had produced in 3 years. She had not sought Daniel out since the morning in the Lower Manhattan office. She had not needed to, and had not wanted to. The path he had pointed her toward was not a path that required his supervision, and she understood that well enough to walk it without looking for permission or approval at intervals. The company held an internal recognition event in the spring, a low-key annual gathering catered with middling sandwiches, held in the large conference room on 12, where people received certificates for work anniversaries and completed training programs. Evelyn attended because Robert Greer had asked the team to attend, and because she was for the first time in her professional life doing what was asked of her without calculating what it cost her in terms of visibility or positioning. She was standing near the back of the room with a coffee when Daniel Brooks walked in. He was with 2 members of the executive committee and was dressed as he had been on the plane and in the office in Lower Manhattan, with complete indifference to the impression he created: dark pants, a simple button-down no tie. He moved through the room the way he did everything without urgency, speaking briefly to people who approached him and covering the space at his own pace. He passed within 10 feet of where Evelyn was standing. She saw him coming and felt without drama the full weight of everything that had moved through her life in the span of 7 months. The suspension, the office on the 3rd floor, the morning light through the window, when she had said the truest thing she had said in years. She felt it, and set it down. She stood up from the chair she had been leaning against, and moved it slightly to the side, making space, a clear and simple gesture toward the better view of the room. It was not theatrical. There was no announcement in it. It was just the instinctive thing she did now when someone needed the space she was occupying. Daniel noticed. He slowed for just a moment as he passed, and he looked at her with the same direct, focused attention he had always brought. But this time, there was something in it that hadn't been there before. Not warmth exactly. Not forgiveness, because forgiveness implied a ledger being closed, and what was between them had never quite been that kind of debt. It was something closer to recognition. The acknowledgement, between two people who had seen each other clearly under difficult circumstances, that the person in front of him now was not entirely the one who had existed before. He smiled, small, brief, and entirely genuine, and then he moved on through the room. Evelyn stood where she was with her coffee and watched him go. She thought about what he had said in that low-lit office, that destroying someone capable of change was a waste. She had turned those words over many times in the month since, and found each time that they landed slightly differently, depending on where she was standing when she picked them up. Today, they landed the way the simplest true things tend to land, when you've finally stopped arguing with them. She had spent the first 34 years of her life believing that value was something you accumulated, titles and accounts, and the precise arrangement of things that told other people where you ranked. She understood now, in the particular way. You understand things that have been demonstrated, rather than explained, that she had been measuring the wrong thing. The things that had protected Daniel Brooks in that first-class cabin, the things that had made her contempt roll off him without leaving a mark, had nothing to do with his 70% share ownership. They had been there before anyone in that cabin knew who he was. They had been built from something she didn't yet fully have, but was for the first time genuinely trying to learn. The sandwiches were mediocre, the certificates were modest, the room was full of people doing real work without an audience, and Evelyn Carter stood among them with no title and no performance, and nothing to prove, and felt, with a quietness that surprised her, that she was exactly where she needed to be.